U.S. and international law dictates that they be given a fair hearing, but President Trump wants to turn them away. What's next for the caravan of asylum seekers gathering near our border? A beacon of rehabilitation hope. Inmates come together to learn in new Donovan State Prison programs. And while its founder calls it miraculous for diabetes patients, doctors debunk it. The hype and facts behind treatment offered by Trina Healthcare. I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer. And joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today, Fronteras reporter Jean Guerrero of KPBS News, KPBS education reporter Megan Burks, reporter Peter Rowe of the San Diego Union Tribune, and health reporter Cheryl Clark of iNewsSource. Well, hundreds in a caravan fleeing violence in Central America have arrived in Tijuana. They say they plan to turn themselves in at the border and ask the United States for asylum from the deadly situation back home in places like Honduras. Donald Trump and his administration have falsely accused them of plotting to enter the U.S. illegally. So, Jean, what's the latest? It's a developing story. How many folks set the scene there in Tijuana for us? So
the last 3 buses carrying about 150 people came in last night. So everyone's here finally, just over 300 people. And the latest is that today and tomorrow they're going to be getting legal training for how to handle their asylum cases when they potentially get accepted into custody with Customs and Border Protection. Immigration attorneys from the U.S. are going down and doing role playing with them, letting them know what their rights are and trying out different scenarios, like what happens if they get separated from their children, which is an increasingly common practice among immigration officials.
Now, it's been called a caravan. It's been in the news for a long time here. Who are the people traveling north across Mexico? So
it's been happening, these caravans have been happening for about a decade, organized by this group called Pueblos Sin Fronteras, a human rights collective, essentially. And they are mostly women and children who chose to participate in the caravan, largely because of the safety in numbers, but the purpose of these caravans is to raise awareness about the violence in Central America. The Trump administration has been pushing this idea that the caravan plans to enter the U.S. illegally, but the people who I've spoken with and the organizers of the caravan insist that they're planning to present themselves at the San Ysidro port of entry on Sunday to ask for asylum.
And briefly, what does the law say in terms of they get a hearing at that point? They say, I'm fleeing violence.
Yeah, so federal law says that people who present themselves at the border, whether it's at a port of entry or even if they jump the fence, if they ask for asylum, they need to be taken into custody by the officials at the border so that they can see an asylum officer who then determines if they have what they call credible fear of returning home. And if they do, then they are placed in detention centers or released on parole until they can see an immigration judge. But more often than not, especially under this administration, they're being kept in detention. And that's kind of why there's this idea that, if it's so easy to just come in and ask for asylum and get into the United States, why doesn't everybody do it? And the reason that they don't is because the immigration proceedings take such a long time, and you can sit in detention for months, even years. So unless you're really desperate, most people don't want to.
And as you said, families are separated commonly now.
Exactly.
Now, there are shelters down in Tijuana mostly. You've talked to some of the folks. What are they saying?
Yeah, so most of them are staying at migrant shelters across the city. Some of them are actually already lining up outside of ports of entry, waiting for their turns to cross because they want to get there before the large group on Sunday. So I spoke to one woman, Jamie Pastora Castro, a Honduran woman who was there with her 2-year-old baby, and she was very scared. And
all right, let's hear that.
I didn't come here to cross illegally. I came here for help, for the president to have a heart, since he's a human like us and was also created by God.
And so what has President Trump said? He's tweets and other comments on this?
So he's been saying that he's ordered the Department of Homeland Security to turn the caravan away, and is very much, not just him, but other agencies within the federal government are very much painting this caravan as a caravan people who are trying to enter the U.S. illegally. So, I mean, he's used the term illegal immigrants and saying we need to stop them. There was a petition circulating from the White House yesterday trying to get names, signatures using the caravan as here's why we need the wall. We need to keep the caravan out, sign if you want the wall. So he's very much using the caravan as this way to push his border wall.
But there's a clear distinction here from people who come over and find places where there isn't a wall or a fence, and the typical border crossers and these asylum seekers. That distinction seems to be lost, right?
Right, exactly. So it's not clear how the border wall would stop these caravan members, most of whom plan to present themselves at the port of entry and seek out an interaction with a customs official.
Mm-hmm.
The woman you spoke to, you have really beautiful footage of her cradling her baby in the middle of this plaza, and you see a lot of women and babies in the footage that we have. Was there anybody else there that may kind of fit the profile that the White House wants us to see in this group? Any single men or anybody who's not really a mother and a child?
At the port of entry, I didn't see any single men wandering around. I did see some single men at the migrant shelters, but those who I interviewed also said that they were here fleeing violence. I saw a lot of them helping out the single women with their kids, playing with the kids and stuff. So it's all of them are saying that they are here to present themselves at the port of entry to ask for asylum.
What's the nature of the violence back in these countries that they're fleeing?
So a lot of it is gang violence, extortion by gangs, people who are too poor to pay the tax that is imposed on them by these gangs, and so they get death threats and then they have to run away. Most of the caravan members are coming from Honduras, where a recent presidential election has led to violence in the streets. And the election happened last fall, but some of the people I interviewed say that they're still being targeted. There's political violence. People who express their opposition to the government are being made victims.
All right, and then before we leave this segment, I did want to ask you, the immigration attorneys that you referenced earlier who've worked for years with the asylum seekers, what are they saying about the Trump stance and his administration stance?
So they say that he's using the caravan to rile up his base. And it's interesting because these caravans were organized to bring attention to the plight of asylum seekers, to the plight to the situation of violence in Central America, but the Trump administration has essentially taken the narrative away from the human rights groups and the asylum seekers, and is invoking the caravan as a symbol for why we need the border wall and tougher immigration laws.
All right, we'll be looking forward to more reporting over the weekend as this story continues to develop there in Tijuana. Well, a deadly prison riot in South Carolina made headlines this month. 7 dead, nearly 24 injured as rival prison gangs attacked each other with homemade knives over territory, money, and power. Underfunding, inadequate staffing, lack of rehab programs, simmering racial hatred were among factors cited. It all reinforced stereotypes of prison life in America. But in Donovan State Prison in southern San Diego County, a vastly different prison unit exists, a new place, a fresh experiment in rehabilitation. So Peter, describe Echo Yard here, kind of physically, and who's housed there?
I think when you enter Echo Yard just as a civilian, I mean, what you see is pretty stark. It's this large open space. It's about 2 football fields long and wide. The walls are 70 feet tall. They're just sheer concrete. It's a very stark place. And yet the inmates there say it's a terrific place. One likened it to a trip to Disneyland. And that's because if you're a prison inmate, if you're someone familiar with prison culture, this is a very different place. For one thing, the races mix, which is unheard of, in other yards. And they're also what they call the special needs prisoners, the inmates. They're also integrated in the group. So you have transgender inmates. You have inmates who have mental issues. These are just all part of the group.
And you quote one prisoner saying, you have to earn your way in. What does he mean?
Sure. I mean, as you might imagine, the inmates who come to Echo Yard are handpicked. These are inmates who've been in the system. Most of them have been in the system for decades. And when you ask them, why are you here? Almost without exception, they told me murder. So I mean, it's not like these are, you know, the best of the best.
Not misdemeanors here. Yeah.
Right, but they've been in the system a long time. They've decided that they are no longer going to be members of gangs. They're no longer going to be dealing drugs. They're no longer going to be involved in violence. They're making a pact that they give up all of that, and in exchange they get programs, they get a certain amount of freedom within the yard, and they get to live a more normal life.
And when did Echo Yard open? How many are housed there?
It was December in 2016, and close to 800 now.
Okay, which is quite a bit. And how many overall, and what percentage of the population in the whole prison?
Well, Donovan has 5 yards, and each of the yards has about 8,000 people.
So it's roughly 1/5 then. Mm-hmm. Now, there have been many reported problems since this has been set up. Is it working pretty well? Because you say it's awfully unusual to have all of these folks integrated into a prison.
Well, it is an experiment, and I don't think we really have a long enough period of time to say, you know, hey, it's working perfectly. We don't know what the recidivism rate is coming out of Echo Yard. Also, the prison is not terribly forthcoming, you know, with any kind of stats about perhaps smaller crimes that happen within Echo Yard that might not make the news.
Cheryl?
I think one of your stories said that there were fewer staff required for this.
Yes, right.
And I wondered about cost. So,
sure.
Is it cheaper to house this, even though it required a whole new building, given the expense of staff?
Yeah, I asked the captain who was in charge of the yard. I said, you know, you're offering all of these programs. They've got like a recording studio. They've got a lot of musical instruments. They've got classes. I know that Megan's going to be talking about this later, but they've got classes inside the yard, college classes. All of this costs money. I asked him, I said, well, how do you fund that? And he said, you know, it's easy to fund because it costs us about 1/3 less here than it does in other yards because we have fewer staff.
And so far it's worked. They might, if it does work over time, they might expand it to other units within the prison?
Well, this is not the first place to try this. San Quentin, just about the whole prison, is doing something similar. So the State Department of Corrections is rolling this out across the state. It's the first yard in San Diego County, it's the first yard at Donovan to do this. But yes, they are looking at expanding the program.
All right, Megan, let's talk about that other program that you've reported on, education opportunity offered to inmates.
Yeah, excuse me. And this opportunity, it's run by Southwestern College, and it's actually on the Alpha Yard. So it's a level 3, so the second kind of riskiest yard. But prisoners there also, you know, in there for attempted murder, for voluntary manslaughter, robbery.
Violent crimes, yeah.
Yeah, and they've, in 2016, were offered this opportunity to start taking not just, you know, college courses or correspondence courses, which has normally been the case, but to sit every week face-to-face with a Southwestern College professor and actually work toward earning an associate's degree in business. So it's a very structured, full-fledged degree program.
So is that how it differs from other programs that are typically offered in prisons?
Yeah, prisons have always offered inmates the opportunity to earn a GED, to participate in art classes or other vocations. But starting about 4 years ago, the state, there was really this momentum in California to increase rehabilitation opportunities. And the local or the state community colleges have really grasped onto that and brought these programs in. So it's a relatively new phenomenon.
And when you talk to these student prisoners, I guess we'd call them, what do they say? What do they hope to do with their education once released?
A lot of them, they want to use what they're doing just to have stability on the outside and then use that to give back. So a lot of them want to become counselors, drug and alcohol counselors, or they want to get into public speaking or talking about kind of wellness with ex-offenders.
And like Peter's story with Echo Yard, desegregation plays a part in this college program, right?
Yeah, so the prison staff were telling me that on the Alpha Yard, things are still highly segregated, but once students get into that classroom, all of the racial divisions kind of melt away, and they're doing group work together and talking about philosophy and poetry together. And they said that, again, not a lot of data provided, but they said anecdotally, at one point, the guys in this class were responsible for actually diffusing a fight on the yard because they had grown this camaraderie.
And wanted to zero in, you had a separate story, someone who is no longer at Donovan went through the associate's program. How's he doing? What's he saying generally and how it helped him?
So he got out of Donovan about 5 months ago. He was on parole, or had an ankle monitor, and he's been officially free, but of course still on parole for a month now. And in the past month, he's used all of his time to figure out how to continue his education. So he's hooked up with a program for former inmates at LA City College. He's looking at finishing up about a few classes there and then moving on to CSU Long Beach next year. Then he wants to get a master's so he can counsel basically former inmates.
All right, and we've got a clip from that interview with John Schimmel. Let's hear that.
Become real machoistic where we're like, I don't like, I'll figure it out on my own. So I think developing that habit as far as going to school and you're asking professors for some kind of guidance or some kind of help, I think it becomes a natural thing where you don't feel embarrassed or feel prideful.
Yeah, so he's saying, he was talking about how, he was doing all these correspondence courses individually, but
which have been going on a long time.
Right,
business, yeah.
But once you get into a classroom with a teacher and with colleagues, you learn to actually ask for help, and that's really been key for him on the outside, because now his days are structured around asking for help, going to his college counselor, going to a job counselor. So that was really key for him, he said.
And the folks who are teaching the programs, are they pretty encouraged by the results?
Yeah, all across the state and in Donovan also, the students behind bars have a higher average GPA than the students outside. And these are guys who have a wealth of experience and who have all the time in the world to sit and talk. And so the one teacher I spoke with said that his discussions in this class are just better than anything he would get with 18 to 22-year-olds at the Chula Vista campus.
Well, that is a hopeful story, and we'll look for more follow-ups on both those stories. Thanks, Peter and Megan. We're going to move on. For the 30 million diabetes patients in the U.S., it sounds like a miracle cure, a treatment that restores vision and damaged kidneys, heals wounds in legs and feet, repairs damage from stroke, reverses heart disease, ends pain, all from IV insulin infusion. But medical experts call it a scam, the miracle being it's gone on for so long. So Cheryl, start with this. What is this, quote, artificial pancreas procedure, and who's the man pushing it here and across the country?
Well, yes, this has been one of the weirdest stories I've ever spent a lot of time on. And it basically is a 4-hour-long infusion procedure in which insulin is pulsed into a person's vein. And the theory behind it is that this substitutes what the pancreas does by stimulating the liver to produce enzymes and thereby increase metabolism.
But no studies to show that this actually works.
But no studies to show that it actually works. And one study, very small study, showing exactly the opposite. There have been just a lot of anecdotal details about stories from patients saying, oh, it cured my neuropathy, it cured my retinopathy. But the thing about this is, as I ask these patients, well, what else have you been doing in the last 3 or 4 years that these clinics have been taking off around the country, and there's a lot of them. You have a lot more diabetes drugs. You have these continuous glucose monitors, which keep patients' blood sugars from spiking out of control and sending them to the hospital. So you have all these other things going on, and since there haven't been any controlled studies, you really don't know what the heck is going on. And there is a very strong sense that I've gotten from scientists that the longer the intervention, the more intense the intervention, and this is a 4-hour intervention, the bigger the placebo effect. So yeah.
I want to get to in a moment what a lot of the experts and the doctors you interviewed are saying, but the fellow behind this is not even really a doctor, right?
No, he's not. He calls himself Dr. Gilbert because he has a PhD, or he says he has a PhD, which he said he got from an online university. But
G. Ford
Gilbert is a Sacramento lawyer, and it's kind of a story. He had worked with a prominent endocrinologist at UC Davis who had developed this theory, which he'd only tested in type 1 diabetes and thought maybe it had some promise. But anyway, this Ford Gilbert, he sort of took this idea and began commercializing it over the last 10 years or so. And
again, with no studies and no real basis that this works. So diabetes specialists, you talk to a lot of these folks, what do they say?
I talk to so many endocrinologists and diabetes researchers, and I don't recall any story that I've ever done where I got doctors to be so harsh. Scam, they called it fraud, they called it P.T. Barnum, they said it's a terrible consumer abuse, and on the record, so you don't usually get that kind of candor with a procedure that is going on all over the country, and Medicare and insurance companies, big ones like Blue Cross Blue Shield, are paying for it.
Yeah, now they had paid for it, but your story points out more and more the insurance companies and Medicare are saying, no, we're not.
Right, and without boring everybody, it all stems back to 2009 decision by Medicare that said this broad category of pulsed insulin infusions done on an outpatient basis had no evidence of benefit, and therefore Medicare wouldn't pay for it. And insurance companies usually follow what Medicare does. And but the thing is, they didn't. These clinics were not billing under that code that Medicare set out in 2009. They said if you're going to do these outpatient things, you have to bill it this way. But
so they might get paid under a different code than the code.
Well, right. Actually, it's sort of like a 4-hour-long procedure. Well, it's the equivalent of 2 office visits plus a glucose test plus an insulin procedure plus a pump maintenance charge, and all of this adds up to about $1,200 per session, which are paid out at between, I saw billing statements from between $400 and $700, and gradually around the country, coders are starting to see this and see, hey, this was what Medicare decided.
Now, how does Gilbert make his money? He's raked in millions over the years with this, right?
Well, right. And I've talked to a number of clinic investors and even a hospital that took this on the promise that Medicare and insurance companies were paying for it. And gosh, if Medicare and insurance companies are paying for it, it must work. And they would basically pay out between $300,000 and $800,000. $300,000 and $800,000 for the franchise rights. They didn't call it franchise all the time. They called it a subscription
But that's
fee.
what they were, franchises.
That's what they were, basically, to the rights to use this protocol and call it Trina, brand it. And it paid for the pumps. But these clinic operators basically had to get their own building, had to hire their own staff, had to get compliant with state regulations. And then when Medicare and some of the insurance companies determined that this was basically the 2009 decision and weren't covering it, these folks were left.
Well, and you talked about one without, and it was a long story, and we don't want all the details, but in Montana, it was this couple who, the husband had the disease, the wife, they'd gone in and left with $1 million, and unfortunately the fellow died recently too.
Yeah, and this is a small rural town in the middle of, the closest nearby town is Butte with only 30,000 people. This is a town of 4,000 people. And the people who started this clinic, who were persuaded by Ford Gilbert that this was a good business for them, in addition to maybe resolving some of his complications from diabetes, he was the coroner and the deputy. They were the coroner and the deputy coroner and the owners of the only funeral home in a 4,000 population town. So everybody knew them and thought, oh, well, these are leaders in our community.
And got in very deep with that, Megan?
Actually, he received the treatment and was a believer, right?
Yes.
Did he continue to believe that it was the treatment that made him better after he started to lose so much money to this
That's
franchise?
what he and his wife insisted to me over and over and over again. We actually went to Montana. We took our photographer and our videographer and Lori Hearn, my editor, the boss of iNews Source. We all went up to Dillon, Montana, and spent 3 or 4 days there interviewing the doctors in the hospital.
And he's since died, and she's left with, as I say, this $1 million debt, but she's still a believer, right?
Yes.
I did want to set up a bite. You interviewed G. Ford Gilbert, this entrepreneur, I guess we'll call him, in Sacramento. Let's hear what he says. He's still a believer, too.
So the Trina treatment is by no means experimental, because you do experiments to find out what's going to happen. We already know. To a moral certainty, we know.
And obviously the experts say, no, you don't know, it doesn't work. Now, there's also a federal indictment in Alabama involving all this. We've got a little time left. Tell us about that.
So G. Ford Gilbert is accused by, in Alabama, federal fraud, racketeering, bribery, and wire fraud charges for trying to bribe state legislators to pass a law, to introduce a bill and pass a law that would force Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Alabama to pay for this after the insurance company had decided that there was this 2009 decision that said it didn't work.
All right, so we're out of time, but that'll proceed on the criminal side, and then we'll see what happens and follow up on that amazing series of stories. Well, that does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, Jean Guerrero of KPBS News, Megan Burks of KPBS, Peter Rowe of the San Diego Union Tribune, and Cheryl Clark of iNewsSource. And a reminder, all the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for being here today, and join us again next week on the Roundtable.